Right, this chat I'm going to do tonight started off as one of our local authorities wanted to get together to write a prelim paper. So they came to me and asked me for a wee bit of advice about it. So this is actually something I've wanted to do for quite a while, because I don't think it's something that kind of SQA really kind of engages in. And I think it's something that maybe we should do a wee bit more of as a kind of CPD thing. Writing exam questions is quite a skill, and I found that when I've actually hung up my exam writing pen this year after almost kind of 20 years of doing it, and I still remember when I kind of started, in that I went along to my first meeting thinking, yeah, I've got all my Int1 questions here, they're all fantastic, and then they proceeded to be utterly torn apart for the next 3 hours. My 40 marks worth, and then they moved on to the guy that had been doing it for 3 years, and it took 45 minutes to go through his part. So it's something that I think that we all assume that teachers can do. You're teachers, of course you can write questions, and it's not actually the case. Some people are very good at it, some people aren't very good at it, and need a wee bit of practice. If you're working together as a region, it's quite nice to identify the people who are, and maybe kind of give them a job of doing some. But what we can all do is we can all get kind of better at it. So the idea behind this tonight is it's going to be focused mostly on writing a prelim, but the kind of things that I'm talking about will also apply if you just wanted to write a kind of end of unit test, something that you want to write for a kind of unit assessment, something like that. After I'd been writing questions for a while for SQA, changed how I was kind of doing things in my department, in that all my kind of end of topic tests, etc., were all written in kind of SQA exam style questions. The idea being that right from the beginning of the year, my classes were getting practice for the exam right at the end. So to kind of explain as a kind of starting point, we'll start off with kind of what the SQA do, and then if you are thinking about coming to write your own kind of paper, then I can go on to a wee bit of advice about how I think you should do it and how you can maybe kind of work together. So at SQA, there's a team of 3 of us that deal with the national qualifications computing. So we've got Robbie Patterson, who's the qualifications manager. Robbie's the one that's ultimately responsible for everything. It's his neck in the line if something goes really wrong in the exam. We've got Scott Durkin, who's the qualifications officer. Scott does a kind of admin role, works with Robbie, so he kind of helps set up meetings and things. But Scott takes a far more active role than his role actually should suggest. So he does a lot of editing and checking and reading. Fantastic proofreader, Scott. So it's always good to get kind of as many eyes in these things as possible. And then you've got me, the subject implementation manager, who's supposed to be a kind of subject specialist. So we are all, there's a kind of group of us. All the kind of bigger subjects have a full-time SIN. Some of the kind of smaller subjects have somebody part-time, but there's a SIN for every subject. And we are all ex-teachers. We're all people that have come from the classroom to work with SQA. As well as that, when we produce a paper, we employ people, which we call appointees. So every paper and assessment has got a principal assessor and now a deputy principal assessor as well. The principal assessor is responsible for overseeing the process to create the exam, and the deputy is responsible at hiring a National 5 for the assignment. And my appointee hat these days is I'm deputy principal assessor for National 5, so it's me that's in charge of creating the assignment every year. We all have 3 writers, so every exam we put together 3 people, and they get told which section they're going to write and the number of kind of marks that they've got to produce, and it's expected that when they come to the first meeting that they will have a kind of first draft ready. We'll go through a couple of meetings doing that, and then we employ checkers, or vetters we used to call them, but they're called checkers now, and they see the paper when it's complete at home, and then they also come to a meeting, and by that point there's about 8 or 9 people in the room who are sitting kind of going through the paper, and then when we get to a kind of finalised stage, we then send it out to validators who kind of go through the paper in detail, trying to kind of catch the kind of last few things. For the assignments, we actually get people to work through the assignments as if they were a pupil, just to check it. So how do we do this? Well, we allocate work and we get our writers together. The questions, as I said, are kind of redrafted a couple of times and then put together in a paper. SQA has got editors and graphic artists, so we've got people that after the kind of writing stages is done, we make it look like an exam paper at that point. and then it goes through the kind of checking process, and it's going to be drafted another couple of times. After that, it still gets looked at quite a lot. It still gets looked at by the PA, by Robbie and Scott and myself at SQA, and we kind of have kind of lots of kind of minor discussions via kind of email and so on, until it gets to validator stage, and then it goes out for kind of final edits. So if you wanted to write a prelim, my advice to you would be not to try it on your own. I remember doing it years ago when I'd just started writing, and it's hours and hours and hours of work. So if you do fancy doing it as a region, it's quite a good thing to do, because if you have a homegrown prelim and you can keep it secure, then you can use it for more than 1 year. Any kind of commercial prelims that are out there, SQA assume that a commercial prelim is in so many schools that it's going to be in the public domain after a year. And then it gets treated like an SQA paper, where if you want to turn it into a prelim, you've got to chop it up and mix it up with other papers to kind of make it valid. But I would suggest that if you're going to do this, you get a group of people together who want to do it, you kind of allocate the work, same way we do the SQA. I would suggest that you do some kind of checking. So don't try and kind of attempt this on your own and think that that's it kind of done and dusted. I think one of the problems with the kind of commercial papers that we see, and it's nothing that I kind of hold against them, because it's a different kind of setup, but they tend to be written by one person and checked by one person from what I know, and that's always going to lead to some kind of errors and kind of wording or clarity or things like that. They're never going to be as good as what we do at SQA, because we obviously have a fair bit of money kind of invested in these things to go through the process. I would also check at the end, once you've finished, for a kind of A to C balance, just to check that that's okay, that your marks that you've got kind of good coverage of the course. I'm going to talk a wee bit about that later, and that you've got kind of clear marking instructions for everybody that's using it is kind of singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to actually marking it. And I've put that in big capital letters down at the bottom. Nobody writes perfect questions. Even somebody like myself, I think I ended up being the second most experienced question writer by the time I retired. There's a guy at Advanced I has been doing it for longer. But even I go to meetings after doing it for like 20 years, and some of my questions just get thrown to bits, because you look at it with your kind of own eyes, and you kind of see the intricacies in it, and you kind of understand what you're trying to explain, and then somebody comes along and says, I don't get that, and there starts an awful lot of discussion to get to the point where they all do understand it. So I always say to people that if you are going to go through this process, and I say this to kind of young writers that kind of come in and join us, you have to have quite a thick skin. I think there's one kind of characteristics of teachers is that we are in our classrooms, we're kind of masters of our own domains, and we very rarely actually get somebody kind of watching us and kind of checking what we're doing. This whole process is the kind of opposite of that. Everybody is checking what you're doing, and they're checking it deliberately to try and pull it apart. They're trying to find flaws in it, and as a teacher, you might not be kind of used to that. So you have to kind of come at it with a thick skin and not take things personally if you're going to do this and kind of work with other people, because taking it apart is a good thing, because it makes it better. I always say to young writers, have a kind of mindset of bring your questions to the first meeting, and after that, almost kind of disown them in your head. Think they're not my questions anymore, they're actually everybody's questions, and we're all here to kind of make them better. If you do want to create a prelim at the moment, there's the kind of current setup that we have for SQA. So this is obviously with the options at the moment, so this isn't the full 110 mark paper, it's the 80 mark paper, but for software development and computer systems, we've got 55 marks, 10 computer systems, 45 software, roughly. It doesn't have to be exact. If we're a mark or two out in either way, we're quite happy with that. 15 to 20 marks of short questions, so that's the ones that used to be in section 1 of the paper, but are now in the kind of initial questions in each of the sections under this kind of optional model, and 35 to 40 marks long. And then for both databases and web, 5 short and 20 long. And I think at higher, we've actually got 6 short and 19 long. Within each question, and particularly within the longer questions, we try to have a kind of a flow, starting at analysis and ending up at evaluation. Maybe not covering all of those sections, but certainly in that order. We realised that when we started writing the specimen paper to begin with, and we were kind of jumping from to design up to testing and then back to implementation, and it just didn't sound right, because a question is going through a scenario, it's going through a kind of story. So you don't really want to, unless you can justify it by saying that as part of testing you found something wrong, and you go back to implementation. But apart from that, it really should go from kind of start to finish and flow like that. When I write, and my principal assessor taught me this when I started, and I still do it, I print off the content grid and I sit with the content grid beside me, and as I write questions, I kind of tick off what I've asked. One of the biggest criticisms that we've seen of kind of homegrown prelims and commercial prelims when they're submitted to us for evidence, for appeals and so on, is that they can be quite focused on one area of the course. And you really have to be assessing kind of consistently across everything. If you're assessing on a small area, for example, I remember seeing a prelim years ago that had 6 marks on data types. Now, 6 marks in data types means that you're not, apart from it being quite a relatively easy part of the course, it means that you're not actually assessing all the rest of it. So we would actually knock a couple of marks off that with the kind of validity of the paper. So you don't have to do it that way. Make up a spreadsheet and do it other ways. That was just my preferred way, because it was a nice and easy way, and I wasn't kind of flicking between different software packages and so on. And as I said, I still do it to this day. So what are short format questions? Well, they're usually a mark or two. They tend to be one question, but they might have an A or B in it. It's very, very rare for it to go up to C, and we would kind of try and avoid that. And also, they don't tend to have a context. So there's no kind of story with it. If you look at the question on the right, you've got a database table there. The question is really saying, here's part of a select statement, identify the double sort at the end. Now, adding a wee story around that about, it's, picture frames and crystal vases. So you can add a wee story about an antique shop that's got a database, and here's the table that they're using to store the data. Knowing all that doesn't change that question at all. You could miss that entirely out, look at the table, look at the question, and answer it without the kind of wee story in front of it. The story makes more sense in the longer questions, but in the shorter questions, try and avoid them. Just try and be very kind of factual with what you're presenting. Long format questions tend to be about 10 marks. Again, that's an approximation. It's not something that we have to stick to. They always have a context, so there's always some kind of story taking place. Fraser was making fun of me the other day on my Twitter chat before this meeting about the fact that I write questions that I've got my dog in them all the time. So Penny has appeared in a couple of questions. I think my son's appeared in one question. So I tend to write things that are meaningful to me. I think up a lot of questions and ideas actually when I'm walking the dog, and I've got notes in my phone of things that I've thought of that I'll then come back to later when I'm actually writing something. Long questions will obviously have several parts, so A, B, C, D, occasionally up to kind of G and E, and within that you will see kind of sub questions that are kind of part 1 and part 2, and as I said, they're written from analysis to evaluation in that order. This is something that we kind of assume that everybody knows, and then you kind of talk to a few people and they don't have a kind of straight kind of definition of it. So when we're writing questions, we talk about the stem. So the stem is the introduction up at the top of question 7 there. And then each of the questions below that are A, B, C, D are questions about a different thing. So the first question there is about testing, and the second question there is about reading code. So that's what makes it an A and a B, as opposed to a 1 and a 2, which also has a stem. It's a kind of sub-stem within the question. But the 1 and the 2 will be about the same thing. So both of those questions are about that stem, and both of those questions are about data representation. And that's what makes them a 1 or a 2 rather than a C, rather than a B and a C. This is one thing that we see a lot in the evidence that's submitted to us. When we changed from standard grade to CFE, I was, back in those days, I wrote the specimen paper for the first National 5 along with one of my pals. And we had to get out of a kind of mindset of what standard grade was. Because standard grade was always 50% knowledge and understanding questions, which are really just kind of factual questions, very much kind of state questions, and 50% problem solving. And with CFE, we wanted to kind of change that up so that computing, which is a problem solving subject, that should be reflected in the exam. And we were working with people in kind of universities who were kind of suggesting different ways of doing things, and there was a few kind of committees involved. But there's two examples there. So the top one's a very much a knowledge and understanding question. What do those 3 letters stand for? I think that was from a foundation or general paper. And the bottom one is a question about buses, but it's very much saying here's a wee kind of context that's kind of within. So the kind of context gives it that kind of problem solving element. It's not problem solving in the way that you write a bit of code to kind of do this, but it's still better than the question above, which is really just recall more than anything else, rather than actually showing any computing skill. One bit of advice, if you start doing this for yourself, is when you read through something, have a look at the word count. We love to tell stories when we write, and particularly in the questions that have kind of context, you'll find yourself saying, Greig is an antique shop, blah, 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 and eventually you lead up to your kind of database question. As I said earlier on, a lot of that is meaningless, and a lot of that doesn't actually add to what you're trying to assess. So it's quite common for us in meetings for somebody to say, that first sentence there doesn't add anything. And then whoever's editing the paper deletes it, and you look at it and you think, yeah, right enough, the question's still the same question. Word count's quite important, because if you have a paper with a high word count in it, then you're favouring the people that are better readers in class. And that's a bit unfair, because what we are trying to assess is their computing knowledge. We're not trying to assess their ability to read. We're not wanting the poor readers to have less time to actually answer the computing questions because they're too busy reading the 2 paragraphs that led into the question that they're being asked. A bit about marking instructions. Marking instructions can be quite hard to define, and one of the questions we quite often get asked at things like kind of markers meetings, or some of the kind of emails I'll get, is is this alternative answer okay? When you're writing marking instructions, what you're trying to do is not hone down on one specific answer. You're trying to kind of be more general than that. And think of it, a good way to think of it is almost like a kind of checklist of what you're looking for in the answer. Some of the things within that checklist might be kind of very easy to identify. Some might be that the person marking it might see 2 or 3 different things that actually meet that kind of bullet point that they're looking for. A good marking instruction should be able to apply to lots and lots of different answers, and the marker should still find it relatively easy to come to a definitive mark at the end of it. One thing that's worth looking at is if you've written a question and you're struggling to work out what the marking instructions are going to be for it, then I can almost guarantee it's a poor question, and you need to go back and kind of rewrite the question. A good way to think of it is actually the other way around. And sometimes if you want to actually think what you're trying to assess, think of the kind of that almost kind of checklist of what you want to have in the marking instructions, and then work back the way and actually then write the question to aim for that. So as I said earlier on, marking instructions should provide a framework that can be applied to any response rather than detailing a limited amount of answers, which will usually be restrictive. And the one thing to remember, and an email that I get fairly regularly at SQA is this answer okay? Marking instructions are not definitive, and we teach that to our markers that mark the exams every year. If you see another answer that is correct, but it's not in the marking instruction, it is a correct answer, and therefore you give it marks. A to C balance. Now, we did a wee bit of work in this last year with the ACM when you guys were having to basically do what we do every year because of COVID. So we did produce a few kind of understanding standards presentations for this. I did one for National 5, and the principal assessors for higher and advanced higher did one for those 2 levels as well. Basically trying to define what an A mark question is and what a C mark question is. An A mark question should be one that's challenging and it should be one that's achievable by approximately 30% of the people that sit the paper. And a CMARC question should have at least 50% of the candidates getting it right. It's not a definitive thing. It's not something that you can have a good go with, certainly with a lot of experience. You can have a very good go at predicting how a question is going to behave and how a question is going to work. But kids will still surprise you. And then you get other things like, a question has been done very badly one year, and then we put that into a report at the end of the year, and teachers read the report and say, well, that was done very badly. So they spend a bit more time teaching it. And then the same question goes from an A-mark question one year to a C-mark question next year. It is a wee bit of a dark art, and as I said, it does take a wee bit of experience, but it is worth thinking about, because a prelim paper that has only C-level marks in it, that has no kind of challenging questions in it, and the same is true of kind of end of topic assessments as well. If one of your kids gets 100% in an assessment or a prelim that has only C-mark questions, then all they have proved is that they're a C candidate. They haven't provided evidence that they're an A candidate. And that's obviously quite important if you're going to use any of what you produce as evidence when you're sending it to us to challenge a mark or provide evidence for absentee candidates, etc. And lastly, using the appendices. So when we did the courses a few years ago, we took a decision to try and fix something that I think had been wrong, certainly since I'd started teaching, in that some of the detail that had been given in kind of previous arrangements of the courses was quite kind of vague. I remember the cracker in Higher a couple of versions of Higher ago, where it simply said HTML and nothing else. And as teachers and as a PT at that time who was trying to kind of devise a course, I'm kind of looking at this and I have no idea what I'm going to teach. And it ended up kind of coming down to almost kind of, as you saw what was in the exam, you would kind of see what the kind of level was. And that's wrong. We should know exactly what we're kind of teaching. So we've still got the content grid at the start of the course, at the start of the course specification document. But if you go to the end of it, all the appendices are there to kind of provide two things. They're supposed to provide more detail for things that we felt needed kind of expanded on from that content grid. But they're also used by writers. And I would advise you, if you're going to do a prelim or if you're going to do an assessment and you're going to write a few questions, look at the appendices, because the appendices are showing you examples of how we're going to lay out a database table, how we're going to lay out code, how we're going to write the standard algorithms, what nomenclature we're going to use when we're showing a one-to-many relationship in an ERD. All of these things are in there so that we have consistency when we produce papers. I always think it's okay as a teacher to decide how you're going to teach these things. And if you want to teach an ERD and you want to write 1 to M instead of the wee crow's feet that we use, that's absolutely fine because it's valid and it's correct. And if one of your kids writes that in an exam, we will mark it correct because it's valid and it's correct. But I always felt that when I was doing this, I wanted to write in a way that was preparing kids well for the exam. And I think the best way to prepare them for the exam is to make sure that whatever you're doing, whether it's an assessment or whether it's a prelim, it looks as close to the final exam as possible. And I think that is me.